for sure that things are going to happen in 2025. Some things. Just things. There will be a lot of things that happen in the new year that we can't possibly anticipate because life is like that. And there are a lot of things that we assume will happen, but that we really can't be sure about. As usual, we're not in control of much of anything, although we do have influence and power to shape some things in our lives. And you might be surprised to know that moment to moment, you're actually more likely to have control over your thought process and the flavor of your thinking than you might actively realize. Much of what makes up our mood and even our personality is thought patterns. And here's something that I learned years ago from the researcher Daniel Goleman. Most emotions last maximum 10 minutes. 10 minutes. So even the worst, most difficult emotions, research has shown, last about that long. So again, most of what we're made up of is really our customary responses to everything that gets inputted into our brains throughout the day. What we're doing with spiritual practices like meditation on loving kindness, for instance, like the Psalm 1 that we just shared, we're using ancient technologies to train our minds. When you put your body on a mat or a cushion or in a chair or in the positions of Tai Chi to focus on your breathing, or when you attend a worship service, or when you focus your attention in the car as it wanders from what is happening in front of you, or as you create your position of presence to really fully listen to the person in the dialogue group, you're training and orienting your mind. This is a power available to everyone who's cognitively able to manage it, and it is a gift. So one resolution you may choose to make in the new year is simply to keep trying to orient your mind in a certain way, to gently pull it out of well-worn tracks and scripts that might be really comfortable to you but are not really serving you, and to introduce new and more helpful patterns to the flowings and the workings of your mind. Ancient technology. You know that I have from this pulpit in this church cautioned against what I call toxic positivity, which is when we avoid or bypass sorrow, the shadow, the denial, when we engage in rather the denial of the hostility and violence within ourselves, and insist that everything's for the good, and engage in that kind of "you got this" kind of cheerleading before we've even really bothered to listen and again just remain present to what is really happening and how hard it really can be. Toxic positivity is actually a form of intolerance. It says, I can't tolerate difficult feelings. I can't tolerate discomfort. I gotta help us speed past it. Let's go, get in my positivity speedboat and let's just quickly try to cruise past this. And that doesn't build any muscle for resilience and ability to abide with the realities of pain, suffering, unknowing, and failure. So I want to invite you to feel confident in this new year to gently correct anybody you may know who might be engaging in toxic positivity and rushing you through what might be really generative and helpful darkness. We will suffer, and we will fail and hurt and stumble in 2025. We will take some bruises and have our hearts broken, just like every other year. We wouldn't want a crystal ball to let us, know exactly when it's all coming. Wouldn't that be awful? I wouldn't want that. But that crystal ball is called life, and it just keeps rolling. I make a calendar. I'm one of those irritating people who makes a calendar of her cat and dog every year. With quippy captions. I assure you I don't inflict this calendar on anybody who hasn't asked for it. One of the pages, April, tax season, I thought that was appropriate, is captioned, "Nothing is certain but death, taxes, and cuteness." And you got this, of course, adorable image of the dog and the cat. Because you know what? Cuteness is also promised. So this is going to get a little weird and unexpected, I think, right now when I tell you that over the past couple of weeks, I have been really taken by a retelling of the Dracula myth. Filmmaker Robert Eggers' Nosferatu, which offended some people by coming out in the theater on Christmas Day. Did anybody see Nosferatu? Okay, because you're not a weirdo like I am and obsessed with Gothic horror. So people thought it was blasphemous. They were like, it's Christmas Day, how could you? But in fact, a lot of the action in Nosferatu occurs at Christmastide. This is a horror film, and it's not my usual choice. I do like to read Gothic horror. I don't like to see horror movies, but I saw the previews and the aesthetic of the film thrilled my soul. This is one of the most beautiful movies I've ever seen. And I did something unprecedented, which is that I went back to the movie theater to see it a second time. The cinematography, costume design, score, screenplay, and acting are all absolutely brilliant. The story concerns the undead monster Count Orlok, a sorcerer who lived in the mid-1500s in Transylvania. It's Dracula. And is awakened by and obsessed with a woman named Ellen in 1838. So that's when the movie is mostly set, 1838 Germany. Now, if you know Dracula and vampire lore, the plot will be familiar. This particular version has some innovations that I'm not going to get into here, but which introduce complexity of motives and a really wide variety of possible interpretations. One of the wonderful things that social media has given us is the ability to create and join public conversation about art. And so I spent some time reading and sharing thoughts about Nosferatu, sharing these ideas with complete strangers in the hours and days following my 2 viewings of the film. And what I noticed is that many people who were critical of the film thought it to be slow and boring. And that's perfectly fine, no argument with that. But I'm disappointed for these people because I was captivated by every moment. And I wonder if some of that sense of this is boring happens because we are so used to having a 2-minute attention span and lots of quick cuts in a lot of what we watch and see. Beyond the critique of boring, though, I saw many, many comments by people who dismissed this film as stupid or lame because they couldn't engage with the material, which is not a straightforward narrative with clear explanations for all that occurs. This film, like most of our lives, or much of our lives anyway, is a dreamscape. It's not an action film or a superhero movie. It's not a crime story that you know is going to get solved at the end. It's not a detective procedural with, all the legal rules that you can count on and that we hope we can count on in life. It's not a sitcom where the laughs and the tears are sort of broadcast in advance for the audience and we respond as if on cue with our chortles or our sniffs at the touching moment. This movie is more akin to sitting over tea with somebody and listening to them share a nightmare or a fantasy. It's more a fairy tale that great-great-grandmother might have told you. It's full of questions and imaginal beings and ambiguities, and above all, It's about good and evil and how they shadow, shade, intertwine, and dance with each other. I don't think people have a very easy or comfortable time with that. There's more than one monster and one villain in Nosferatu. And many viewers obviously could not come to terms with the presence of shadow aspects in the beautiful, tormented heroine, her husband, really nice guy, by the way, her husband's best friend, and other characters. They wanted black and white. And this story, again, like our lives, is fog, mist, flame, silence, and magic. So I want to encourage us and advise all of us, and in fact exhort us, in this new year, in this new era, not to be so wedded to the literal and the informational. Information and literalism, something where you see it and it is what it is and you can kind of nail it down and know exactly what you're looking at, they will only take us so far. And I hate to say this, because we have such a rationalist religious tradition, but rationalism also has its limits. For one example, I think, it's fine to study the factors behind the rise of right-wing ideologies in America and elsewhere in the world. I'm doing that myself. I'm reading On Tyranny, and I forgot the author's name, just a nice little book. And it gives some political and historical background for what's, these political movements. And it's fine to watch the news. I do that too. I want to stay informed. But I hope that we will also stay attentive to story, parable, folklore, the weird, murky stuff that can't be explained, dreamtime narratives that keep us in close touch, not just with information, but with the dramatic unknown of individual and collective psyches. Does that make sense? I don't know if some of the terminology I'm using is maybe not accessible to you, so let me know. We can talk about it. So what I'm saying is, what information do we really need about someone who drives a truck into a reveling crowd on Bourbon Street in New Orleans? How much information do we really need? How much of a motive do we really need? What's that going to do for us? Of course, we need some information, but I think just enough to understand where in the shadow of that man's psyche he became attached to violence as a worthy response to his anger, pain, hostility, his shadow side. I think that's about as much information as we need. In other words, to say, where does that happen in the psyche, and how do we stop it from happening to the next person? How do we heal? How do we go in there? How do we gather people together to help them address that shadowy inclination within themselves? Because we all have it. What does not get integrated in the person gets projected outward. And that's how radicalization happens for all of us. What does not get integrated in your own psyche, the darkness and shadow aspects of our own psyche, gets projected outwards onto that person or those people with very, very dangerous consequences. When we use words, as we often do here, like love, justice, compassion, and service, and when we appeal to those forces, I want us to caution that they do not become simply rote words in our mouth that don't mean anything, meaningless terms that we kind of trot out regularly without imbuing them with spiritual energy and life force. I know this is, again, very metaphysical and may not make sense, but it's okay for everything to not exactly make sense. When you say justice, where does that live in your body, your imagination, your memory? How does it get manifested? When you say love, Is it just coming out of your lips? Or is it something that's coming truly from you? Reconnect with that. Pay some attention to that. We will move forward, not only by sense and clear understanding, but also by instinct, by intuition, by feeling things together, by trusting inclinations, and by saying what we sense. In Nosferatu, there are two little girl children of a wealthy family, all decked out in their beautiful 19th century Christmastide finery. They're like beautiful little dolls with the curly curls and the little bonnets and the beautiful satin gowns, who cry to their mommy and daddy one night that they do not want to go to bed now because there's a monster, and the monster will get them. Now, how many times have we heard that from our children? The monster under the bed. The parents reassure them, as parents do, that they're being silly. And they say, nothing bad will ever hurt you. I'll protect you. Nothing can ever hurt you. You know, those children, of course, meet a dreadful fate because it's a horror movie. And this is a story about vampires who represent a voracious, wild force of evil. But aside from that obvious fact, what I saw in those little girl characters were symbols of the wise instinct, the inner child, who senses and knows things and should be taken seriously, whose fears and concerns should be honored. We all have that inner child. If we identify with the adults in the story, the adults, we can enter the narrative and say to that inner child and that outer child, that actual child, I hear you. I hear you. I'm going to sit up by the fire with you. Would you like some warm milk? How can I comfort you? What can we do to make the windows and doors more secure? I believe you. We are always shaping and building and guiding our own minds and mentoring the many people who exist within each of us. As we do this, to respect what earlier generations called the prompting of the Spirit, I hope you will make room and time for wondering, musing, and building those interior muscles that allow us to remain okay even when life is uncomfortably open-ended and, yes, scary. None of us has a crystal ball. No pundit, no political analyst, no historian, not your smartest friend or professor. So it's not really a good idea to keep throwing ourselves into the arms of those who are full of certainty and the accuracy of their predictions. Notice the flurry of anxiety created by this kind of content as people desperately try to inform and prepare one another. It's too much, it's excessive. Yes, for instance, the bird flu is here, right? You've been hearing about that. We want to learn some about it. It's mutating, and I want to get as much information as I need. We want to get as much information as is helpful. But how much is obsessive? Just as the practiced cook knows not to add too much salt, take moderate doses of certainty and information and learn to leave the room when you've had enough for a quieter, more open space in your mind when it's been too full. You will know. You do know. Respect what you know. Richard Rohr writes, and I included it in the order of service, unless we are led to some kind of contemplative practices that continually reveal our dualistic, argumentative, and biased ways of thinking, we won't move into a new stage of life. What we really need is a sustained practice that rewires and transforms our hearts and minds. Even in the midst of suffering, even in the reality of non-control and not in charge, we can, singly and together, move into a new stage of life. It's a stage where we know in our deep selves that whatever difficult realities we have to tolerate and cope with, there is and there abides an unperturbed place in your body and soul that cannot be violated and can never be destroyed. This will be a serious year, my friends. We live in serious times. Nevertheless, we will continue to orient ourselves to the beauty, the possibility, and the hope, even within the shadow and the mystery. Okay? Thanks for listening. I know that was long.